This is the Living Vernazzano podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. We are a podcast that discusses the intersection of Scripture and our lives. Together, we continue the conversation that was started each preceding Sunday morning in our worship gathering.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
I'm Natasha.
I'm Brittany.
I'm Derek.
And we are the Living Vernazzano podcast, back with you this week after taking a week off as we spent some time up in the mountains as a church and, as a greater church with a bunch of other churches as well. But we're continuing this conversation that we've been working through as we study the book of Romans. And as a quick reminder, 2 weeks ago, we started reading chapter 11, looking at verses 1 through 10. And in this set of verses, Paul writes about the remnant of Israel and what that means. From this, we discussed how the remnant represents the first fruits through which God intends to reach all others. This week, we're going to be examining Romans chapter 11, verses 11 through 24. And in this set of verses, Paul addresses the ingrafting of the Gentiles and the implications for others. I believe we have Natasha reading for us today. So Natasha, would you read Romans chapter 11, verses 11 through 24?
Yes, Romans 11:11. Again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? I am talking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I take pride in my ministry, in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. For if their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but tremble. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Consider, therefore, the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree?
All right. Thank you for reading that for us today, Natasha. As we move into this conversation that we're going to be having about this set of verses, I think just because it has been a couple of weeks, it is wise, but also because it's always wise to keep it in context, but it's wise for us to just remember that at the closing of verses 1 through 10, specifically looking at verses 8 through 10, Paul kind of concludes that section with references to the Old Testament, looking specifically in Isaiah and then also in Psalms. And essentially these verses might leave somebody in the place where they're like, oh man, it's over for Israel. And I know, again, in 2 weeks ago's episode, we addressed that and we talked about how, that wasn't the case and how like Paul had to be brought to the end of himself for him to recognize just how much he was in need of the Savior. And so we kind of looked at those verses in a different light. But again, it's easy if you're just reading along to think and have this thought cross your mind that, well, it seems like it's over for Israel because things are said like God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see and ears that could not hear. And then a little further down, may their eyes be darkened so they cannot see and their backs be bent forever. Like it seems pretty ominous and pretty conclusive that it is the end for Israel. But as we move into the conversation for today, as we read that first verse, Paul comes out immediately, much like he did at the beginning of 2 weeks ago's passage, and just addresses and dispels that thought that might be present when he says, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. And so Paul doesn't want to leave any room for a misunderstanding of what he's trying to communicate by using these passages, and immediately comes out to address any thought somebody might have of, oh, well, that's the end for Israel. He says, no, it isn't. Like, that is not at all what this is about.
And his conclusion at the beginning of this week's passage in verse 11 really is kind of what fueled and drove our interpretation and conversation of the usage of these particular Old Testament passages in two weeks ago.
Yeah, in verses 8 through 10.
Yeah.
And so with this exclamation from Paul of not at all, like the Israelites have not fallen beyond recovery, what are we seeing? What are our thoughts? Where do we want to go with this passage and this conversation today?
Well, I think Paul picks up right where we left off last week where we left off 2 weeks ago, with this idea of sometimes you have to fall really far. As in Paul's story, you have to be blinded to actually be able to see. And he's explicitly stating this in the first couple of verses where he talks about how his desire for his whole ministry to the Gentiles is not that he's forgotten about his own people. It's not that he doesn't feel this burden for his own people, which we know this because we've read the whole book of Romans and he's expressed it
multiple times
previously. However, he's hoping that his call to minister to the Gentiles is going to bring about such a radical shift, such a dramatic kingdom entrance that it will catch the attention of those who are looking in from the outside. So it's going to catch the attention of those Jews who have rejected that Christ is the Messiah. And they're going to become envious of what they see. They're going to long to have access to that kingdom that they see in breaking. And that's really Paul's ultimate desire, that they will fall only to be lifted up again, just as was his story. And he wishes that for every single one of them. And I think, again, like as we bring this into our present day, I mean, this is the hope of the church, right? That the church is supposed to be this kingdom inbreaking that's so beautiful and so attractive that people can't help but want to be a part of it. Unfortunately, it doesn't always look that way. It didn't look that way at the church in Rome because of all the division.
Right.
But that's the call, and I guess that's what Jesus desired. It's what he prayed for when he prayed the priestly prayer for the church that would follow.
I feel like the thing that I notice or that sticks out to me the most through this is the hope that comes through this not at all statement. And then the following statements, recognizing that their fall does serve a purpose, even when that's not what they wanted and not what God wanted. It still serves a purpose in bringing the Gentiles to this place of knowing who Christ is, and not just knowing him about him, but knowing him. And in that, I feel like there's this call or this desire from Paul where he recognizes having all of them together in the body makes the body better. Not just that having the Gentiles is a good thing, but working through the Gentiles and seeing what they've been missing. It's like that first love. When we were in the mountains, we had this few things came up, and through speakers where we see this, we were reminded of this first love that we have, and reminded that God is that first love. And it's almost as if or Paul almost point blank says that he's working through the Gentiles to remind the Jews of their first love. And so there's this story of hope, even when we miss it. God can still use our broken situation and still bring about something beautiful. And I love that he doesn't give up. Like, he relentlessly pursues us with this overwhelming desire. And not just him, but he uses people like Paul who've been through this place of brokenness and were relentlessly pursued. And now he's using his story to help pursue those who are falling into the same kind of traps, much like you talked about, Natasha.
It's in the business of continuing to graft back in.
Something that you just said there, Derek, is something that's kind of been hanging with me for a couple of weeks, and then again was also reinforced this last week when we were up in the mountains, when Pastor Steve Rodeheaver was taking us through Revelation. One of the things that he brought up with that conversation was just talking about how like the stuff that was coming, like the wrath that was being poured out, the bowls that were being poured out, and the horns that were blowing, and the things that followed, the things that ensued as a result of that, were pretty tough things that we worked through. But like at the heart of it was this conversation that everything was happening in an effort to get people's attention back on God, like to help everybody recognize who was worthy of worship. Not Domitian, the Roman emperor of the time, but like God was worthy of the worship. God is worthy of praise. God is worthy of our focus. And so all of that stuff in Revelation was working to that end of getting people back to that place. And not necessarily in as crazy, chaotic, graphic as a way. Like Paul is even talking about that right here in the hope that you brought up, Derek, with this like idea that, you know, they have not fallen beyond the ability to recover, and they're being cut out, made the room for you to be able to be grafted in. And so just this idea that a tough situation, like people being cut out of this family tree that they thought they lived in, like that would be hard. That would be something difficult to grasp and to overcome and to deal with. And yet, like that difficult thing is serving the purpose, like a twofold purpose of helping the Gentiles recognize who God is and how he's worthy of worship, but then also helping the Jews themselves recognize who God is and how God is and how he is worthy of worship, and how they are in need of him. And so just this theme, this continual theme, I feel like that we've been dealing with. And, you know, again, 2 weeks ago, as we talked about Paul, like being blinded is not necessarily something to be excited about. And yet it was his blinding that allowed him to see, as you brought up, Natasha, in referencing 2 weeks ago. And so it's just this idea that the hard stuff that we face, like God can use those and does use those things to help us recognize our need for him and to get our attention back on him and our focus on him. And I think I agree. Like that, there is so much hope in that. Even in the junk, there is hope that we can see, because we recognize that like God is in the business of grafting and God is in the business of reconciliation. And so the stuff we're encountering is not because he's cutting us off and we're at the end of it. It's because his hope and desire is that at some point we'll be grafted back in.
As we were talking about this passage with the kids, we talked about how this piece is so necessary, because we could just imagine, you know, the Gentiles are sitting there and they're listening to Paul harp on the Jews and criticize their overemphasis of the law. And at this point, like, they're pretty puffed up. They're thinking, yeah, that's right. You tell them, Paul, see, I told you we were right. I told you following the Spirit was the way to go, you know. And there's so much, like, I guess, patting of themselves on the back that you can just kind of
Right.
imagine. And Paul doesn't know. He's writing this discourse. I'm sure he's like assuming, well, maybe this could be a potential thing, so we better
Well, I'm sure
address
he's
this
heard
right
some
now.
things about what's going on.
Yes, yeah, for sure. He seems to know tons of people, as we'll get to at the end of the letter. The number of personal addresses is just astounding for a
Right.
place he's never been to. But with this, so we kind of imagine this and envision this. And so it's so important that Paul takes the time to address the potential arrogance that might be emerging or the lack of humility, because his end goal is unity.
Right.
And if you bring down the Jews and elevate the Gentiles and never address the reverse arrogance issue, then you're still left with a fractured church. And
Right.
so Paul works here to bring balance in a very, very essential way, as he begins to remind the Gentiles and address them specifically by name that they're only a part of this beautiful, wonderful heritage and promise because of
Those who came before.
because of what has existed. And so because of the law, because of these things, and while those weren't executed perfectly, and while the heart of what God was trying to accomplish wasn't fully grasped or manifested, that doesn't, I mean, you still need to be very reverent and respect what it is that this tradition, that your salvation now is really built on. And so like we had a fun discussion with the kids regarding imagining what that would have been like and how Paul couldn't leave this part out of his letter. That is just really important. And as we got to talking more about that, I think personally, as we reflected on it, it's very humbling to consider the reality that I'm only here where I am because of people who have come before, because of the faithfulness or because of the lack of faithfulness that God has used. That's the only reason I am where I am. And that is incredibly humbling. And I feel like it fills this huge responsibility that you have to, one, remain in that humility, but then also work on mission to bring back those who have gone before and maybe are still missing it. But again, you're here because they missed it and God used them missing it for your betterment. And now it's like you feel this same obligation that Paul feels to his own people to be on mission to bring them back in, to use your advantage for their gain.
Yeah, I think on a personal note for me, as I was preparing for this conversation last week leading up to Sunday, and working through the midweek meditations, I came to this place really where I found myself like, Jesus, I believe I heard you saying to me and reminding me of the humility that you are calling me to have, very practically in the place that we are in. I mean, I think most of you who listen to this know that the structure and format of our get meeting times on Sunday is very different. The way we look as a church is very different than kind of a traditional church structure and setting. And there has been no shortage of battles and conversations that we have had with countless others who have looked at what we are doing and have challenged it and have, called it to task in one way or another, saying that it doesn't live up to the standards that they would expect a church live up to. And at the beginning of it all, it was easy to just continue to engage in conversation and try to help people understand why we do what we do and how we really do believe this is what Jesus is calling us to do and what it should be looking like here. Not that they have to do it, but that this is what we're supposed to do. And maybe there's something they could learn from it. And as time has gone on, I'll confess, like I have gotten, maybe arrogant could be the right word to use, but really just annoyed and like I don't even want to bother with these conversations anymore. And because it's like, you know what, they should know better by now. I'm done with this. And so maybe that is kind of an arrogant attitude. And so I felt like Jesus checked me in the same way that he's taught, in the same way that Paul is talking to the Gentiles. I feel like Jesus was checking me in just right where I'm at. Like, hey, Nick, much like what you said, Natasha, don't forget that you are where you are today because of the people before you, whether because of what they did correctly or maybe didn't do like I wanted them to do, but I still used that to get you where you are today. So don't forget that the reason you're where you are is because of them. And I need you to have grace, and I need you to not look at them arrogantly. I need you to look at them with love and tenderness and care, just like I look at them. And so if another conversation comes your way, be gentle and kind. Be humble and grateful for who they are and what they have done in your life to help you get to where I have you. And so I think, again, that was maybe more of a personal confession, but I think maybe all of us can look at that. It's very easy. And maybe this is related to church. Maybe it's just related to personal life as an individual, but it's very easy as you kind of progress on in life to be like, I'm where I am because of what I've done and what I've accomplished. But there's a lot that has gone into that. And so maybe either whether it's inside the church or outside the church, this is an opportunity, an invitation for each of us to look at our own life and where we are and give credit where credit is due and recognize how God has used those around us, whether we want to give them credit or not, but how he has used those around us to help us get to where we are and where he has us. And, related to that in a way, but kind of moving on from it at the same time, when you look at verses 17 through 21, kind of where the heart of what I just shared is coming from when it talks about if some of the branches have been broken off and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. And we can go further. But in a conversation with somebody else in our church, this conversation came up, and his statement was like, how dare me, a branch, think that I could have anything to say to another branch? Like that I can somehow tell that person how better to be a branch, even though they are a branch and I'm a branch. Like I don't have the room to, like, you don't see a tree. You don't see the branches of a tree tell another branch how to be a branch. Like they're just a branch because they're connected to the root. And that's like where they get their information from. And it doesn't take the branch next to them to tell the branch adjacent to them what to do. Kind of this idea of, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. It came out of, this conversation came out of that statement, and how easy it is sometimes for us for him or for us as a branch to be focused on the other branches around us and how they are doing well to be a branch or not doing well to be a branch. And he's like, how silly is that? Like, that's just silliness. Paul calls it out as silliness, and it's true.
Yeah, I can see how that statement could come about, because for me as a branch, I feel like I have one purpose: to produce fruit. I can't tell somebody else, well, I can, but that may be overstepping my bounds in telling someone else how to...
Overstepping your branchness?
Yeah, to how to produce fruit. But if I'm always rooted, I'm always getting what I need to produce fruit. Like the source of me being able to produce is getting what I need from the roots. I can't give that to another branch. Only the root can give that to another branch. And so in that sense, like, yeah, it totally makes sense, like where he's coming from in that statement. And the thing that came to my mind is John 15:5. I am the vine, you are the branches, and remain in me. And that's what came to my mind the whole time. Like, as I was going through this, like, I know that I need to remain in the roots. And I know that there's plenty of room for other branches to be grafted in. And so if I remain in the roots, if I remain in the vine, like, I know that and my focus is only on that remaining, that God is going to help me to be able to produce fruit so that other branches can be grafted in. Because, like, as I read this, that I can think of nothing but hope. But, like, I'm thinking of, like, Jack and the Beanstalk, where, like, this tree goes on and on and on and on forever, and there's plenty of room. There's never going to be room for a branch to run out. And even if the branch is cut off for whatever reason, it's not too late. That branch can be withered and dead. And from our perspective, like, if we're looking at it like in agriculture, like here where we are in the Central Valley, that branch would serve no purpose. I can't put it back in.
It's a good burn pile.
Yeah, it'd have to go to the burn pile. But God is patient. He wants his burn pile to come way later. He's not looking to burn it off, like to burn it now. He's leaving that there, knowing that there is hope. And so, like, if we do our job in just remaining, and allow him to work through us, and we keep going to the source, he's going to use us to produce. And those limbs that look useless and look like they should be burned still have purpose.
I think one thing you said, Derek, was, talking about like where we get fed from, and you can't give it away. But you also, I think about, you can't be fed by a branch. I'm not going to get any nutrients from a branch, more specifically, a branch that isn't even connected to the root. And I think it's very important to remember where you're fed. I so many times in my past, I would hear people, "Oh, that was a good message. I feel fed. I feel fed." And I think a lot of times the pastors not at our church, but the pastors on the stage, they're giving the message, and that's how we're quote unquote fed. And I think it misses the purpose of the branch being grafted. The branch isn't grafted to be fed from another branch. The branch is grafted to be fed from the root. So if you are not being fed from the root, if you're only getting fed on Sunday, you're starving to death. So just remembering where you're receiving your nourishment.
You can't feed another branch. Like, if a branch tries to leech onto you, you're both going to die. It's like when people follow pastors instead of build a relationship with, like, God, they were building a relationship with a man or a woman. And when the man or woman moves on, like, there's nothing left. Like, you've attached your, like, idea of who God is to a person instead of to God. So,
and maybe that's the thing with what you were sharing, Brittany, is like, it's not that the pastor preaching on a Sunday and delivering the word of God is a bad thing. It's this idolatrous habit that we've developed out of it, where we feel that that's our only source of nourishment, and we're counting on this pastor to nourish us, as opposed to recognizing that every word that comes from his mouth should be from God, and that we have access to that on a moment by moment basis. And so while this is good and this is nourishment, the source is God, and we have access to that same source throughout the week as we live out our lives and as we spend time with him.
And I think that's essentially what Paul is drawing out here when he says, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but tremble. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. This idea that, like, grafting in the existence in the tree in the grafted state is a direct result of faith. Period. End of story. Nothing else. And Paul's warning to the Gentiles of don't be arrogant puts them in a place where potentially their focus now has moved from Christ to, oh, look at these piddly Jews and the things that they think. Like now they are no longer focused on the one in whom they have faith. They are focused on the ones around them that are lacking faith. And so with this shift in focus, they have now put themselves, yes, in a place of arrogance. That's how he draws it out. But they've put themselves in this place where they're no longer focused on and connected to the root that is nourishing them. And they are in danger of being cut off because they're no longer rooted in that faith. And in the same way, like when we today do not remain rooted in our faith in Christ by keeping our focus and our attention on him, we put ourselves in a dangerous place. When we focus on other people, when we focus on other things, like we're latching on to things that are not the life-giving root. And we put ourselves in a very dangerous place that could lead to being cut off or eventual destruction.
It's this very thing that Derek brought up at the beginning of the episode about that came from this prior week up in the mountains, where we talked about being reminded of our first love and not losing sight of your first love.
Just got to stay there.
Mm-hmm. And keep keep Jesus the center of everything you do, say, everything that motivates, all of it.
And I think you see that in verse 22. Towards the end, it said, "Provided that you continue in His kindness," and so it's this continued process that keeps us in this relationship with Him. That keeps us in His kindness. But what does it say before that? Because consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God, sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue. So our kindness is available. His kindness is available to us as long as we're remaining in Him. However, we also, like you talked about balance earlier, we're balancing now this grace and mercy of God, but also this justice of God. So like eventually there will come a time when all branches are going to like have to answer for what they did, if they remained in the root, in the vine, or whether they decided that they knew better, they had better ideas, their way of living was better. And so we are going to face this time, but we do have hope that if we continue in this, continue in His kindness, that we can remain in Him.
And that those who have not been in His kindness, who have fallen, they still have the opportunity to be regrafted in, and which I feel like compels us to mission. It compels us to continue in prayer and hope and belief that Jesus is working both good things and bad things together to bring in the branches that have been either cut off or maybe never were, but are, that He's working to graft those into His kingdom.
Yeah, the thing that stands out to me here at the end of this passage is this idea of persist in His kindness, and then the flip side of, and if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in. Mm-hmm. Like it speaks to the importance of like the continualness of life. Mm-hmm. Like we have it as branches that are grafted in. That's not just a final statement. Like there is a call to remain. There's a call to persist in that engraftedness through faith, not by something that we do. Like it's not that because we latch on to the branch really, really hard because of the things that we do. It's not because we have really awesome looking fruit. It's because we've persisted in our faith, in our belief. Like that's how we remain. And then, if those do not continue to persist in their unbelief, they can expect to be grafted in as well. If they do not persist in that unbelief, they also can have that opportunity of being grafted in. And so, but again, then once they're grafted in, there's this invitation to persist in kindness, right? And to continue to depend on this faith and live in this life of dependence on the root. And I feel like that just speaks volumes to, it's not just this one-time thing where it's like, once you're grafted in, you're set, or once you're grafted out, or like cut off, you're out.
Right.
Like there's a decision that we have to make on a moment-by-moment basis that defines where we lie.
Much like we talked about a few weeks ago, this is not it's not a finality judgment. There will come a time where there is finality, but there's hope. And I think we got to see some of that Sunday. Like for us, I think we got to see someone come in and be a part of our service that we just tried to love on, and the things that we do here are different. We've talked about how we do things different because because we understand what God called us to do here. We, like Brittany, took times where she didn't come to our midweek activities because there was something more important happening for a branch that needed to be grafted back in. And so we got to see that take place this Sunday, like not this Sunday, but we saw a branch that had been cut off, grafted back in, and even got to have some of the conversations about some of the things that took place with that person. And so just really exciting to see and to know that there is hope. And it's exciting because, like, as you and I shared, Nick, after this service on Sunday, like there are other branches that we are waiting on, trusting that they are going to be expecting that they're going to be grafted in. And like, how exciting is that to see branches grafted in? Like, see ones that are dead, like brought back to life. The ones that people would normally throw on a burn pile. That's exciting stuff. That's, as you talked about, Natasha, like that is the mission. Not just to be a branch that sits on a tree, but one that's fruitful. Not that necessarily it's anything we do, but it's God working through us. Because of what we have experienced, we want to remind others of their first love and be part of that process of helping them see that.
I loved what one of our kids shared during the testimony time in worship. She said that she wants to be the branch that has fruit that's so good that people can't help but keep coming back to take more and more and more. And I feel like that's how we get to see the miraculous stories of these branches prepared for the burn pile that are grafted in. And it's just incredible. It's so beautiful, and it's so beyond what you could have planned up for their story or for their end. It's so much better. It's always so much better. As you journey with us, we recommend purchasing Midweek Meditations, A Journey Through Romans, Part 2, which is available for purchase on Amazon. Also, be sure to follow the Living Vertizontal podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.